Okay. So 100-year anniversary from February 6th until February 11th of 1919. 60,000 unionized workers and another 40,000 workers in solidarity shut the city of Seattle down. And this country that, was just becoming the world's dominant power at that time, but most definitely is the world's dominant power today. The history of the working class is not often told, or it's not told nearly with the specificity that it should be. So us being able to talk about one of the most beautiful, what I would argue, and hopefully you'll agree by the end of it, it's one of the most important, one of the most beautiful examples of workers' power in the history of our country. It's really crucial, and especially since it happened today, or it happened in this country, in this city. It's extremely important for us. The labor movement, part of the reason I think this is really, in addition just because it happened in Seattle and it was 100 years ago, the labor movement is seeing a revival right now, which I think is really important. Folks have heard about the strikes in Arizona and Oklahoma and Wisconsin, or West Virginia, more recently in Chicago and LA and Oakland. And as socialists, we obviously want to do everything we can to help workers win each individual struggle, but because we're socialists and because we want to see not just, socialists in office as politicians, but we want to see democratic workers' control of production. Studying the lessons of what worked and what didn't work 100 years ago, I think is really crucial. And not just, what did they do bad in the city, but is there things we can learn when thinking about, there have been statewide strikes for teachers, but could there be a national strike? How do we build international solidarity and have international strikes, international coordination? This talk isn't going to answer all that stuff. Hopefully it will provide some answers and then probably a lot more questions, and I hope it will generate some good discussion and debate. Real quick, the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics reported, part of, just to give you a couple statistics of why this is important right now, that the highest level of strikes since 1986 happened last year. Over 500,000 workers went out, and 90% of those who went out were teachers, healthcare workers, and according to the governmental body, something called social assistance industry groups. I don't know what that is. The biggest strike last year was in Arizona, where 81,000 educators struck, then Oklahoma, West Virginia, so on and so forth. So the point is, this isn't just a historical, isn't it nice to talk about how great Seattle is? I would argue class struggle is back on the map and that workers are actually winning. And so the question of how can we coordinate these mass strikes, I think is really relevant history. So I'm going to start with a quote from a woman named Anna Louise Strong. She was a member of the Socialist Party back in the day. She wrote for the Union Record, which was a daily union publication, a daily newspaper that the Seattle Central Labor Council ran. And it gives a little bit of an idea of what the strike was like. She says, quote, "From coast to coast in January 19 with the report that revolution was imminent in Seattle. A general strike had been called in sympathy with the shipyard workers, and nobody knew how it might end. Government officials in Washington announced that Bolshevism had made its appearance in the northwest of the U.S. I'm going to skip that paragraph. Ours was the first general strike involving all the workers in a city that ever took place in the North American continent. For years, the IWW, or the Industrial Workers of the World, or Wobblies, had talked of a general strike, and I'll get a little bit into that here in a minute, declaring that the power of workers' folded arms would bring the collapse of capitalism. Few of them claimed to know concretely what would happen when a strike started. It was like pulling the trigger of a gun without knowing what ammunition it was loaded. Government officials and local businessmen said it was loaded with revolution. All our labor leaders busily denied this." And I think that quote, it was like pulling the trigger of a gun without knowing with what ammunition it was loaded, is really crucial. Setting aside the issue of the gun part of it, I think the question it's getting at is, what kind of society are we fighting for? What are we trying to achieve? And if we don't have a clear idea in the future, then the socialists and the anarcho-syndicalists, which the Wobblies were, that was their political tendency, if we don't have a clear answer than they did in the future, we're fucked. All right, so we got to take this stuff seriously. So I'm just going to give a little bit of the radical history in the lead up to the strike. Justice will talk about the strike itself, and then I'll come back and talk about some of the lessons. Okay, in about 5 minutes, we'll talk about 20 or 30 years of radical history. I think some of the most important things is that the Seattle and the Puget Sound region was home to a socialist, like utopian socialist cooperative movement. There were any number of, 10, 15, 20 different, essentially like socialist colonies where people had their, like you might think of a hippie commune except more organized, and they had printing presses, and they were attempting to construct socialism. They had their own newspapers. There was a newspaper called the Seattle Daily Call back in 1886 that was trumpeting the fight for the 8-hour day. There were two main political parties, the Socialist Party and then the IWW, which I already mentioned. The Socialist Party had the second highest concentration in proportion of its population of members of the Socialist Party of any state in the country. Number one at the time was Oklahoma. And they agitated against the war. They supported the work that the Wobblies were doing in the labor movement. The two parties actually worked really, really closely together, and there were a lot of people that were dual party members. The IWW, when it started publishing Industrial Worker, its sort of news piece, started in Spokane in 1909. It led free speech fights, which I won't have time to go into, but it was essentially workers would get up on a soapbox on a street corner and start talking smack about the war, about capitalism, why we need to organize, why we need to stand up to the inequities, and the cops and the authorities would pull them down, would arrest them. There's even, there was something called the Everett Massacre, where around 10 or so Wobblies and their supporters were murdered by vigilantes and the sheriff up in Everett. 200 of them met a boatload of Wobblies and just shot and killed a bunch of them. The labor movement in Seattle was the only official labor movement that I mentioned, the Union Record that Anna Louise Strong wrote for, was the only official labor movement that had its own newspaper. Started in April of 1918, so just about not quite a year before the strike started. It had a circulation of 50,000 people, or excuse me, 50,000 people would buy it, which rivaled the Seattle Times and the Seattle PI and something called the Star that existed back then. I could spend a lot of time talking about, there's lots of really beautiful examples. I think the thing that's most important is that prior to the strike, there were at least a couple decades of radical ferment. People reading the IWW press, people reading the Socialist Party press. The Wobblies were, in addition to the free speech fights, they were involved in organizing in the logging industry. And there were just amazing stories of like work to rule and organizing the timber camps. There's a great book by Harvey O'Connor called Revolution in Seattle. I don't know if we have copies, but it goes through all the history. It's incredible. Last couple points. So there were the radicals, the Socialist Party, the IWW, but Seattle was also unique, and I don't think it's unrelated to the question of the radicals being a part of the labor movement, but Seattle had arguably the most radical labor movement of official labor. The American Federation of Labor back then was basically racist and sexist. It didn't organize anybody but skilled white men. So if you were black, if you were an immigrant, if you were an unskilled worker, you weren't a part of it. A guy named Samuel Gompers was the head of it, the AFL on the national level. Seattle stood for, there's a great quote in another amazing book everyone should check out by Robert Freedom called The Seattle General Strike. A new edition just came out this year for the 100th anniversary. He said basically that the Seattle labor movement stood for everything that Samuel Gompers and the AFL didn't. It wanted to organize, although it's not perfect, but it was better, I guess is what I should say. Last point. What was the spark that led to the strike was in the shipbuilding industry. And in the lead up to 1919, all throughout the war, World War I, the Seattle shipyards produced about a quarter of all ships produced during the war. So tremendous amount of power concentrated into 30,000 plus workers. So they had basically agreed not to strike during the course of the war, which I think is in retrospect a mistake. And so they waited. When the war finally ended, they agreed. The national body that was in charge of determining wages wouldn't meet their demands, so they went out on a strike on January 21st, 1919. In response, 35,000 struck in Seattle, another 15,000 struck in Solidarity in Tacoma. And the Seattle Central Labor Council had talked about organizing There was a case of a guy named Tom Mooney who was going to be put in prison, and there was this talk of trying to organize a national general strike for him right prior to that. In fact, a lot of the key Seattle labor leaders were in Chicago for a convention around that when they voted to strike out here. So the ferment and the discussion of the importance of striking had been going on for years. Within a week of that strike starting, the radicals basically pushed the Labor Council to call a vote. 24 locals within a week agreed to strike. A meeting of union representatives met on February 2nd and set February 6th as the day that the strike is going to start. And I will hand it off to Justice. Take it from there.
If I could take this little block thing from you. Okay. Hey. Can you hear me all right from here? Okay, great. Yeah, so in order to start this, I'll go back to that quote from Anna Louise Strong. So she, longtime labor organizer, revolutionary, really came out of this and launched her, launched her rise to prominence in the labor movement, but kind of went all over the world from there. But she published an editorial kind of just before the strike titled "No One Knows Where" in the Seattle Union Record, as Darren mentioned. And I'm going to be using this because she made a series of declarations in this editorial that actually did come true during the strike, that kind of put forth this larger vision that many of the radicals in the IWW view and in the Socialist Party viewed for the general strike. So, as she quotes, or as she says, there will be many cheering and there will be some who fear. Both of these emotions are useful, but not too much of either. We are undertaking the most tremendous move ever made by labor in this country. We do not need hysteria. We need the iron march of labor. Labor will feed the people. And this, I will quote from this book here. This is the latest book on the general strike, written by Robert Friedheim. He has some analyses that we don't necessarily agree with as socialists, but it's a good document for the actual, moments of during the strike, etc.
Anna Louise Strong.
Good props. All right. So yeah, this was so in a city at the time, Seattle had a population of 300,000, as Darren mentioned, like some of the largest proportion of organized labor in the city. So on Thursday, February 6th, more than 60,000 organized AFL workers laid down their tools. The 10 o'clock whistle blew. They're solidly supported by other working class organizations. Even the segregated Japanese unions joined the walkout with the approval of the General Strike Committee that was set up by the AFL. They, allowed them to even send delegates, but obviously the AFL had a lot of problems at this time, again with racism, sexism, etc. So this just demonstrates on behalf of the Japanese unions how committed they were to supporting this general strike. The IWW sent 3,500 wobblies off their job in solidarity as well, along with the General Strike Committee. They were really like the increase of strikers was of course the goal and inspiring. However, they had concerns that the Wobblies would create disorder. But the Wobblies, for their part, promised to behave. They had no demonstrations, no soapbox speeches, no baiting of opponents, and any Wobbly who disobeyed these orders, the IWW headquarters promised they would be rushed out of town by their fellow Wobblies. So. In addition to all those organized strikers who with the General Strike Committee, there are also 40,000 workers who were off the jobs just because the streetcars weren't running, or they were worried that there would be chaos and revolution downtown and they didn't want to get caught in some gunfight or whatever. However, again, Anna Louise Strong said it, labor will feed the people, and this is exactly what labor went about doing. So milk was sold for cash to supply all across the city to people who, because the grocery stores, etc., were not running, needed milk for their homes. Let me see. On the first day, there was difficulties, as you would expect. Like, they didn't know exactly how much milk they would need to supply. However, by the third day, there were like 21 milk stations selling as much milk as the public would buy. They would have even made a profit by this point, like completely efficiently distributing this milk, if not for the fact that they also covered the cost of some of the feeding depots. As for actual meals that were provided, so the feeding depots were just public spaces, large gathering halls, the labor halls, other locations like there was even like one in the city jail. There was a Zero Pool Hall and various like the Longshoremen's Hall. They just created these large cafeterias basically where meals were cooked in central kitchens, transported in large vats to the feeding stations. They cost union members 25 cents. So if you had a union card, either AFL union card or an IWW union card, they didn't discriminate. You would be, a much cheaper meal, and 25 cents is incredibly affordable at the time. For other general public, it was 35 cents. And they were, tasked with opening essentially 21 different food depots to feed the entire city of Seattle, while the entire city of Seattle was entirely, shut down in this strike. And the first day they had difficulties with the amount of silverware and like utensils available because they didn't anticipate that people would maybe leave their plates at home. By the third day, they were feeding 30,000 meals a day without any difficulties and supplying that entirely based on just organized labor. So I think that's a great indication of like, well, we'll get into more of it later, but the power of labor, as Anna Louise Strong says, to, organize this with the Iron March of Labor without the concern and the hysteria. She also mentions that labor will care for the babies and the sick, and this is exactly what they went about doing. So there are a set of exemptions that were made in the interest of public health and public well-being. The General Strike Committee ensured that there were enough workers left at the city light plant to power the city at full capacity. Telephone operators were exempt to make sure the phone lines were up, so if there's emergency, people could call assistance. There were several exemptions made for the hospitals to ensure that they were treating injured and sick people in a sanitary environment. This was also immediately after a global flu epidemic that killed like a lot of people. It was like one of the most disastrous epidemics in the world history. So this was a huge concern that was taken up by the General Strike Committee and resolved summarily. The coordinating of the labor essentially made sure that the hospitals got milk. All the linens, etc., that were produced were cleaned and taken care of, as well as the various, sanitary conditions, garbage disposal, etc. Whereas the sanitary workers went on strike broadly for the city, they did continue serving the hospitals. Okay, and then, and one more thing as well, the drugstores, even though they were closed from selling all the general goods, they did continue supplying prescription medication. So again, a commitment, even despite the hysteria, et cetera, on behalf of all the, the state, the mayor, et cetera, that this was going to be anarchy and chaos from this general strike, that labor was overstepping their bounds. Labor cared for the sick and the babies. Labor will preserve order. So despite, again, these claims that this was going to be a demonstrous, violent, revolutionary moment, even though it was a revolutionary moment, the violence part of that never came true. And in fact, whereas usually there was about 100 police cases per day at this time in Seattle, during the 5 days of the general strike, there was about 30 per day. It actually decreased significantly. The labor made a call for a bunch of veteran guards to basically, and completely nonviolent with nothing but a white armband, no weapons, etc. There were 300 veteran guards tasked to patrol the street, to peacefully resolve conflict, to break up any sort of, concerning crowds that were maybe going to commit some sort of property damage or whatever. Again, the AFL was really concerned about the Wobblies. The Wobblies were entirely peaceful for this time. And as they went around, they managed to actually decrease the average amount of crime. There was also a lot of police presence and army presence, however, though, and that's something I'll get to in a moment here. So, just to say, so far, to recap, we've managed to feed everyone, care for the sick, the injured, in a way that's, sometimes more efficient than we do in our society even today under capitalism, and we're able to completely preserve order in a way that, again, is more efficient than the way that it was going before and in other kind of circumstances. Anna Louise Strong continues, the closing down of capitalistically controlled industries in Seattle, while the workers organize to feed the people, to care for the babies and the sick, to preserve order. This will move them, for this looks much like the taking over of power by the workers. Labor will not only shut down the industries, but labor will reopen under the management of appropriate trades such activities that are needed to preserve public health and public peace. If the strike continues, labor may fail to avoid suffering by reopening more activities under its own management. And this is why we're starting down a path that leads, as the title of the editorial is named, No One Knows Where. She and many of the other radicals saw this action in the general strike as both a display of the significance of workers' power, but also as a potential preparation for the workers to realize their own power, to also then be prepared to actually seize power when the time came, as they saw in the kind of revolutionary potential of the general strike. However, even though everything that Annalise Strong said came true, the state was also acting. So, even as Darren mentioned, many of the unionists who struck it was a sympathy strike for the shipyard workers. It was kind of a attempt to prevent the ongoing suppression of union membership that would, they were worried that would come at the end of the war, as the kind of wartime industry was starting to die down. The state response was very much so that whatever the unionists said, this was going to be a violent revolution, that they were going to arm themselves to the teeth and actually go beyond the capacities of the standard state in order to prevent this. I'll read a quote here from the mayor of Seattle. The mayor was named Ole Hansen. He says, or is it Ole? I don't know. Ole Hansen, there you go. He says, to guarantee all the people of Seattle absolute and complete protection, they shall go about their daily work and business in perfect security. He said it was entirely absurd claim that he published while he was hiding, and while this whole thing was going on, as they were feeding people by the thousands, right? He says, we have 1,500 policemen, 1,500 regular soldiers from Camp Lewis that can, will secure, if necessary, every soldier in the Northwest to protect life, business, and property. The anarchists in this community shall not rule its affairs, even though they were ruling its affairs. All persons violating the law will be dealt with summarily. So his argument was that this lawless chaos of, significantly less crime happening and unarmed, coordinated veterans walking by and telling people please to go back to your homes, wobblies deliberately withholding their normally chaotic nature in order to make this all go smoothly. And he was saying that we're going to have, they hired 600 extra policemen to serve at this time, at this terrifying revolutionary giving food to people time. And they also hired on 2,400 just volunteers. So a lot of these people were business owners. Some of them, actually a significant amount of them, were from the fraternities, etc. at the University of Washington. At that time, the university was pretty much exclusively upper class, middle class. People who were just, I don't know. It was a bad time. The University of Washington has changed a lot since then, but in some ways maybe it hasn't. But anyway, so they gave them clubs, they gave them weapons. It was a significant cost to the city. It was something like $50,000, and they just threw these people into the streets with no sort of direction whatsoever. And they're like, if you see anything revolutionary, make sure to shut down. And actually, no one was injured, no one was killed. There were arrests, but none of the arrests were actually related to the actions of the strike. So neither these people walking around with guns, terrified of a Bolshevik revolution in Seattle, no one got killed, no one had to be arrested, etc. However, the actual state, so this is all the posturing, etc., by the city and the local government, which felt incredibly overwhelmed. The state also brought in a ton of soldiers from Camp Lewis, which was near Tacoma. They set up machine gun sentries at key locations. They, again, at the shipyards, near government buildings, and even they were here. They're present throughout the city, and this, idiot, the Mayor Hansen, repeatedly threatened the General Strike Committee with martial law. They have these machine guns set up, and he was constantly threatening that if you don't end the strike, if we're not going to compromise with these Bolshevik revolutionists, and if you don't end this strike, we're going to declare martial law, and to stop the food or something. In the meantime, of course, not only did he not have the authority to start the martial law, the soldiers themselves, it was, and there was kind of this uncertainty whether or not they would just fire down their own, fellow working class on the other side of the line. It was totally up in the air, and I think that was also we can talk more about the criticisms of this moment, but that there is still that question and that significant force and that response by the state, even in this what was totally not a revolutionary at all action. It was, or I guess revolutionary intention behind the action. The state still responded as though they were going to seize the capital, take over the state, and also take over the country, and that this was a Bolshevik-like revolution. You know, they were taking, like, there was Russians coming in secretly among them, and you know, it was ridiculous. So, well, you can read some of the headlines as well, because that's actually a great place to start if you're looking back at this history. They are hyperbolic to the maximum. All right. So yeah, I'll read from a quote from this book here that mentions. So there was a this is a quote from the Mayor Hansen, as he kind of writes about it later. There was an attempted revolution which they attempted to spread all over the United States. It never got to first base, and it never will if men in control of affairs will tell all traitors and anarchists that death will be their portion if they start anything. Law and order are supreme in our city. Let us clean up the United States of America. Let all men stand up and be counted. We refuse to treat this revolutionist unconditional surrender are our only terms. So yeah. This guy was insane, but also he was not unparalleled. You know, that kind of sentiment was widespread throughout the United States after years of what had happened in Russia after, you know, at the end of the First World War. The significance of labor power and workers taking over their own destiny terrified everyone in the U.S. that this was going to spread across the world, as it threatened to do in many European countries as well. And it's also not true that, you know, certainly many of the radicals who were calling for this general strike did see this as an example, and we can talk about that as well, but that they were also looking to the success in Russia to say, we can do it here, we just need to, you know, this is going to be our first action to show workers their own power, and in the future we'll build power until we can actually seize power as the Russians did, as the Russian working class did in Petrograd and other places. So, regardless of the fact that the strikers themselves had no intention of actually carrying out the revolution, the capitalist state responded with militarization, mobilizing the layers of the middle class and upper classes. Several actually like capitalists fled the city, went to Portland. I guess the Portland hotels were like filled full of scared capitalists clutching to their wealth. They came back later, unfortunately, and they moved to California as well. A lot of people. So the strike lasted for 5 days, and unfortunately, so even with all this kind of immense power that was displayed in the action of, you know, shutting down the city, reopening it under their own terms with their own labor power, you know, for their own goals, it actually was not as successful in their goal, which was, you know, to help preserve the jobs of the ship workers who initially had asked for this sympathy strike. And it became clear that actually, as they just demonstrated more of their power, instead of it, you know, improving their conditions to, you know, negotiate with their boss, as, you know, the typical labor strike would, it actually closed off any potential for negotiation. And I think that's also an important lesson for us, that if we are in the moment where we have the capacity to seize power, we should be prepared that it's not necessarily going to get us closer to our even more reformist goals. It may actually close that out, and that in order to actually win the demands that we need, we may need to actually seize power, and that they were not in a position to do this during this general strike. And in the result, as Darren will talk about, they did not actually succeed with their goals. On February 11th, the General Strike Committee called an end to the strike. So again, 5 days from the 6th to the 11th. Over the course of the time, many, especially even the radicals and others at this time, saw this general strike as a success. Their intentions were not revolutionary at the time. They had just demonstrated their working power. Everything that Anna Louise Strong said came true, where they, you know, fed the people and the babies were cared for, and all this action just, everyone was like, we can do this again. We have the power. It showed incredible solidarity. Yeah, but I'll leave it to Darren to talk about what the actual aftermath was.
I'll take a couple of those minutes, Justice, that you left off. All right, so what I want to try to do is a few comments about the aftermath of the strike, and then get into some of the lessons. So the American Federation of Labor, I won't read the quote, but the international heads of, there were 110 different unions involved in it. The international heads of the different unions sent, you know, telegrams, sent people to try to close the strike down, and they ignored them, you know, obviously for 5 days, but that pressure was part of it. The AFL put out a statement, which I won't read, where they boasted that they played a role in stopping it, which is horrible. I did want to read, coming out of the strike, Ole Hansen here. I don't know if you can show his picture again. I don't have as good an Ole Hansen voice as Justice. But he wrote a book called Americanism versus Bolshevism. All right? And he did a speaking tour and made $38,000, tried to run for the Republican nomination for president, which, you know, he had his moment in the sun for a year or so. But just to give you an idea, there was a massive Red Scare that happened. There were things called the Palmer Raids, IWW halls, socialist halls, newspaper presses were destroyed, people were arrested, and Ole Hansen definitely played a role. So here's just a little bit of a quote from him in his book. He says, he's talking about the so-called, he's basically ranting about Bolsheviks / anarcho-syndicalists. And he calls them strikingly ignorant, malignantly cruel, with no concept of history, with but an elementary knowledge of social production, with little productive capacity, with no constructive ability. This movement in our country would be ludicrous were it not for the sentimental, weak-minded followers who, steeped in idealism and fanaticism, really believe in a Bolshevik utopia. This is great. Where free milk will run in the water mains and life may be supported without toil. He goes on, all right. So he goes, he says, with syndicalism and its youngest child, Bolshevism, thrive murder, rape, pillage, arson, free love, poverty, want, starvation, filth, slavery, autocracy, suppression, sorrow, and hell on earth. It is a class government of the unable, the unfit, the untrained, of the scum, of the dregs, of the cruel, of the failures, and he just goes on. I mean, it's like the whole entire book is just him ranting about Bolshevism and anarcho-syndicalism. And people paid him almost $40,000 to do that, which is absurd. So anyways, that was the climate amongst some of the politicians in the country because of this supposed revolution. The shipyard strike did continue, but it didn't win its games. In fact, there was a recession after the war, and the industry lost 30,000 jobs in Seattle within 2 years. So there were only 10% more workers in Seattle than there had been in 1914, and it happened all around the country as well. So they didn't win their wages. In fact, most of the shipyard workers lost their jobs. Despite that, though, and I mentioned the Red Scare, but on the same, on another hand, the Seattle General Strike was the climax of, or really the impetus for one of the most massive strikeways in the history of the United States. There were 3,630 strikes involving, so last year there were 500,000 workers that went on a strike. In 1919, there were over 4 million, an increase of almost 3 million in 1 year. So kind of think about how, so it means what? Just a little over 1 million went on a strike 1 year, and then within a year, you know, almost 3 million more. I'm not saying it's gonna happen like that again, but you know, in the moment we're in, who knows? All right, in terms of some of the lessons over the next handful of minutes, Justice laid it out, but despite the fact that most of them lost their jobs and they didn't have a revolution and all that, the history of the strike, the most important thing is because it does show the power of workers. It's an example of the potential, only the potential for 5 days. But I think that's really, that's without a doubt. Like I don't look at the Seattle General Strike as a loss or whatever, because it gave us a glimpse of how 30,000 people could be fed, how peace could be kept without guns, without cops, hospitals could be run, and it could all be done without profit. People still make those arguments. You gotta have profit in order to like make people do nice things. This is an example that shows you don't need that. Okay, try in about 5 minutes to lay out some of the negative lessons. So the General Strike Committee was never really clear, like what's the point of this? Are we striking to have a revolution? You know, they never set a set amount of days. So there was confusion, like what is the point? You know, no one had ever done it before, so that's part of why I think it's okay that they fucked up. Workers were ordered to stay home during the strike. I think it's a major mistake. The IWW agreed not to do their soapboxing. They never had rallies. They never, like, we argue now, like, if folks know with the LA strike, one of the most powerful things is that they had a rally every single day of the strike that attracted tens of thousands of people. You know, you can't tell people in the moment of their hour of power to be like, just stay home, we got it. Like, they should have been having marches through the city. They should have been having speakers. The IWW should have been they should have been in their heyday doing soapboxing, talking to people about radical stuff, but they didn't. you know, had the shipyard workers coordinated with other shipyard workers around the country, that would have been a heck of a lot more powerful, but they were isolated in Seattle. I think the fact that they waited until after the war to strike was a major mistake. They were producing, you know, as I said, like a quarter of the ships, that, you know, of boosting the economy during the war. If they had gone on strike during the war, like, you can see how you could begin to think about stopping wars immediately, like the Bolsheviks did in Russia with the 1917 revolution. We'll get into that in a second. So I don't think they did a good enough job. So I mentioned how for a couple decades prior there were socialist newspapers that the utopian communes have, the Socialist Party had, the daily Union Record was published, but during the strike they stopped. I mean, it's absurd to think. They stopped the publication of the union-run newspaper during the strike. They kicked it in, I think, after the third day. But it's like, so you don't have rallies. I mean, you don't have internet, right? You know, Facebook. We don't have any of that stuff. And they closed down the one thing that is their mouthpiece. And of course, you know, I think I showed earlier the under which flag. You know, the mainstream press was still putting out all their propaganda, but our side wasn't putting out ours. It was a major mistake. All right, in terms of just a little bit of a critical eye about the obviously the main problem is the ruling class. And the official labor leaders from elsewhere trying to shut down the more radical laborers out here. But just a little bit about the Socialist Party and the IWW, which I think is relevant too when thinking about the Democratic Socialists of America today. I think the Socialist Party back then is very similar to DSA today. There were people like Eugene Debs, who was a revolutionary and went to prison for advocating against World War I. He gave a brilliant speech in Canton, Ohio, I think in 1918. I went to prison for it. And then there were also racists and people like this guy, Berger, I think was his name, out of Wisconsin, who was total racist. And I'm not saying there's racists in the DSA right now, but the point is there were revolutionaries and there were people who definitely were not revolutionaries. And they had organized for years and they had their press, but they were unable to chart a different course. And so I just think I think it's important the kind of party you build, the conversations, the preparation. It's not just enough. The dominant ideology, I think, was one of winning people to elections. And I don't think that can play a role in the process of getting people ready for socialism and ready for revolution, but it ultimately comes down to questions of state power, workers' control of production, can you run society, can you deal with all the military stuff that Justice raised. And I would say this, we have to have a critical eye at the IWW as well. I mean, like I already said, I thought it was a mistake for them to stop their soapboxing. And they had led brilliant struggles, but most of their power was like in the timber industries and the logging camps outside of the city. There were Wobblies who were part of the shipyards, but they definitely weren't. They weren't strong enough. So neither of the two parties that had been organizing for almost 2 decades prior were strong enough to be able to lead a revolution. Now there were people. Could you hold that up again? This was written by Harvey O'Connor, who wrote the book Revolution in Seattle that everyone should read. He did his best to attempt to lay out, and 20,000 copies of this got handed out during the course of the strike. But like one leaflet that didn't have a whole party apparatus around it, it wasn't enough. It obviously didn't change things. Justice talked about it already, so I won't belabor the point, but there was no solution for dealing with the question of the military. And Anna Louise Strong has a great quote that deals with that. And then I'll be just about done after that. She said, so she's asking, why did the strike end? She wrote on her autobiography. She's got a chapter on the strike. And she's kind of critical. She's critical at herself and at everybody. She says, but it's more to the point to ask why it happened that as soon as any worker was made a leader, he wanted to end that strike. A score of times in those 5 days I saw it happen. Workers in the ranks felt the thrill of mass power, which they trusted their leaders to carry to victory. But as soon as one of these workers was put on a responsible committee, he also wished to stop before there is riot and blood. The strike could produce no leaders willing to keep it going. All of us were red in the ranks and yellow as leaders, for we lacked all intention of real battle. We expected to drift into power. We love the emotion of a better world coming, but all of our leaders and not a few of our rank and file had much to lose in the old world. The general strike put into our hands the organized life of the city, all except the guns. We could last only until they started shooting. We were one gigantic bluff. So it's kind of a, it's a brutal assessment, but I think it's a very honest assessment, and one that I think our side, the question of the state, the question of the military, the question of the cops and the CIA, and can we just take over political power, or do we have to take over economic power, is really crucial. I think the question of not having rallies, not having mass displays of unity and power is really important for the question of the military. Because during the Russian Revolution, the rank and file soldiers were won over because they shut down the factories, because they had mass marches, because they went up to the soldiers and politically argued with them about why they shouldn't murder the workers. When you don't have rallies, you don't have a public presence, there's no way that they could confront the soldiers and be like, wait a minute, your mom and dad works down at the docks, right? Because I'm certain many of the soldiers' parents had to have worked at the docks, because I didn't show this picture yet. This is the biggest shipyard, Skinner and Eddy. It had, I don't know how many thousands of people worked at it. All right, last couple points. The whole, I mentioned it already, lots could be said. Racism and sexism existed. Women weren't in the unions, blacks weren't in the unions, immigrants weren't in the unions, unskilled people weren't in the unions. There were a few hundred African Americans that worked in the shipyards, but they weren't represented in the unions. To their credit, there were a few thousand Japanese workers who had organized their own segregated unions because the other unions were racist. They pushed and they were allowed to be part of the General Strike Committee, but they weren't given a vote. Which is a testament, I think, to their credibility and their solidarity, that despite all the racism, they stuck it out. And there were women in some trades like phone operators, but, I forget which book I read, but talked about basically, their job is to relate to their husbands who are out on strike, and it's kind of paternalistic, sexist ideas, that they should follow along in their man's, shadow or whatever. Racism, sexism, all that undermine the potential for solidarity. Anyways, lots of lessons to learn from this. Hopefully, between his telling the story and some of the stuff I laid out, I'm hoping that it will generate thinking about what it means for us today, whether it's teachers, whether it's international solidarity. I don't know if folks know, but there's a massive strike going on in Matamoros and Mexico right now, which is really exciting. We have, the labor movement is on the upswing for the first time in a couple decades, but it's still really small what we're doing. It's really, really, really small what we're doing. It's mostly, as I said, with the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics, mostly concentrated in education and a couple other industries. So anyways, the point of this is not just to say this is, we're going to be able to repeat the history. It never happens like that, but hopefully we can glean some lessons from it. I think that the Northwest has some of the most radical, most exciting history to learn about. And I think also this is really important for people to know, and hopefully the idea of socialism, it is becoming more and more popular, but not just in Seattle, but there's radical history throughout the United States, and it's in pockets. In the teens, 19-teens, in the 1930s, in the 1940s, right around 1970 or so, but it's been a while. So we want to, as socialists, try to help teach that memory, but also get out there and get organized and sink our teeth into these different labor movements, but be really clear that we want to not just win a strike or whatever. We want a society where working class people run it everywhere, all over the planet, a socialist society. And it's going to take more than just electing politicians. It's going to take working class power and control of every single workplace on the planet. That is what I think we're fighting for, and hopefully we can encourage some of you to get involved with us and join us.
So with that, we're going to move into the discussion portion of the meeting. So if you are joining us on live stream, thanks for joining us, and we're going to cut that off and